Let's open with a word of prayer. Holy God, you are everything to us. I want to personally thank you for all that you do in my life. How you've led me all these many years to this point. I know my experience is mirrored in the lives of many people. You've led each of us individually to this point. As we anticipate the soon coming Sunday law, we see its agitation throughout society. Help each of us to make an intellectual, an emotional, and a spiritual preparation. In Jesus' name, amen. Welcome back. I apologize. I know we're having technical difficulties at this camp meeting, but things happen. So in our last study, we began discussing the subject of Sabbath keeping. And as is always the case, people have very strong opinions on how we keep the Sabbath, and how we should relate not only to God, but the world in which we live. I changed the context after that discussion to deal with a related subject, which is the subject of the 1850 history that relates to slavery. And we find all of this in the book Early Writings, which we know is a compilation of a couple of books. One of them is Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1. So we discussed all of that in the words that are on the board. We then went to the 1888 history, and we saw that the test that was confronting, we'll say, God's people, we could also say the United States, it was a Protestant phenomena. It wasn't a Catholic-led initiative. And we use the term apostate Protestantism, or at least Ellen White does. And we see that as a singular test. When we go to an earlier history, nearly 40 years before, we know the history. We know about the fugitive slave law. We know about the Civil War and the steps that led up to all of those things happening. The Great Compromise. And we put that all together by saying that 1850 is the Sunday law. We have the close of probation, the time of trouble, ending with the second advent. So that's as far as we got in our previous study. So in the 1888 history, when we compare that to the 1850 history, we saw that that was slavery. At least that's what someone placed here. And that's the Declaration of Human Rights or Civil Rights. So I have a question. We've moved around 40 years into the future. Susan, why is slavery not here? Why is it only a singular issue now of Sunday? So Susan said it's no longer the test. So why is it no longer the test, Susan? Why did God say it was a test and now it's not a test? Why did God change God's mind? And she said different dispensation. Okay, I think that was code word for saying I'm not sure. Okay, so some of us may not be sure, but I want us to be sure that something has changed. That we haven't missed anything. Okay, Gloria?
United States local to Christendom.
Okay, so Gloria says we went from the United States, that. So Gloria's. So 1850 was a US issue. And she says maybe the 1888 is a Christendom issue. Okay, so do you mean that this was United States government and this is the United States churches? Is that what you mean? So she said yes. So then that would sort of mean like it was a state and then a church issue. So what did someone say in this history is happening here on this date? That we mark or we picked up? Sorry? Law. So we had a law here. Do you agree with that, Gloria? And hence state. And in this history, the 1888 history. We know that it didn't go far enough. But what's being proposed here? A law. So it's a law here too. So Gloria, if it's a law in both histories, would it be fair to say that this was state and this would be Christendom?
Yes.
No. No, it wouldn't be fair to say that. Yeah? So it's a state-driven initiative in 50, and it's a state-driven initiative in 88. You agree with that? Okay. So when the state says we want to make a law, people are going to say, why? Defend your position. And they're not going to say, we just like taking holidays. What's the reason for this law? What's behind it? You said it was? So she says church or Christendom. So here, in this history, they have this slavery, and people are going to say, justify it. And is a farmer going to say, I make lots of money on the backs of human beings? They might believe that, but they're not going to use that argument. What argument will they use? The Bible. They will use the Bible or Christendom. So there's not much difference between the two, really. So my question then was, we're in this history, the 1888 history, but there's no slavery being addressed now. Why?
Well, it's an issue of the immigration.
Okay, so there are other issues, but why is slavery not here anymore? Are you saying it's
There's a law to outlaw slavery.
okay? So my question is, why is slavery not here, part of this test or the test? And this was all state. And Kathy said, somewhere in this 40-year history, the state addresses the slavery issue. So it's no longer an issue anymore. So all those greedy farmers in this history, the state says, suffer, we don't care. And all those pastors in this history, the government says, we don't care about you either. Somewhere in this history, there's a change about slavery. Yes? Okay. Claudia. Yes, yes.
We know because of the chiasmatic structure of Eden to Eden.
We know that there's a chiasm, and that model is Eden to Eden.
So following that previous the mirror, we know that from Eve, the sin of Eden, then came Cain, the worship, and then came slavery. So that's the mirror images, and now we're seeing the same thing replicated on this side where we are living. And sometimes it's misleading the Sunday law as a name, because that's in general is the mark of the beast.
Okay, so Claudio has said, based upon an Eden to Eden chiastic model, he said there were 3 issues at the beginning and there will be 3 at the end. He said the third one was slavery, which would mean the first one would be slavery. And he's saying this issue here is fixed somewhere in this history. Yes? Have I represented you accurately? He said yes. And that's what Kathy was saying, yes? Okay, are we all in agreement with this? No mistakes? I have to say that because they blame me for making the mistake. They honestly do. Say I should know better. Okay, so when is that law? Do we know the date? Put your hand up, anybody? Kathy? 1863. So what is the law in 1863? The Emancipation Law. Okay, so Kathy wants to put that law in 1863. Anyone else? Will we agree with that? Suellen?
Well, I thought there was a law that would that pertained to the southern states. Emancipation, proclamation. It pertained to the southern states, but there were like 4 northern states that didn't become law until later.
Okay, so I'm not sure what to write. So I'm gonna leave the comment from Sue Ellen because I'm not sure what, but I don't have something definitive to say on that. Anyone else? Okay, I can't ask anybody who's online because we don't have chat enabled. The threat changed? What does that mean? She said that the threat changed. What does that mean?
Slaves would hard them, so they wanted to put them slavery, but not in 1888. They wanted to control the Jews, there's the immigrants, so they wanted to enforce something.
So in this history, the issue is about slavery and the control that people want over this group of people. And in the 1888 history, there's a similar dynamic It's not slavery per se, but it's control of three groups: Adventism, Mormons, Adventism, Jews, and immigrants. Anyone else? So what about the amendments? Go ahead. The 14th Amendment. Which number? 1-4? 1-3. Okay, so we've got the 13th Amendment. Someone will give me the date for that. As they're looking, the 63 date, even though it's valid, it's in the midst of the Civil War. So it's not a federally recognized law, if I can put it that way. So we've got 1865, and it's the 13th Amendment, which basically does away with slavery. And that's why in this history, there is no slavery. It's not part of the test. So what Adventism has done, it's been selective in its review of history, has focused on the later history, the 1888 period, and says it's a singular test. Sabbath and Sunday. Does anybody have any questions or comments on that? Okay, so now this movement has been raised up. And if we go to its inception, for the first few decades, we were in complete agreement with this model. The Adventist model, I mean. The movement knew all of these dates. It had some clues about maybe 50 being the Sunday law. Depending on what studies one would look at. Because why? I don't know if people are familiar with some of the earlier studies. Why do we have an awareness of this? Before Elder Test brought this study to us. Go ahead. No, why we knew that this was a Sunday law. Someone just asked a question and I didn't. They just wanted clarification. Claudia.
The chart. No, we went internally. We went to. We have to.
So my question was, before Elder Tessie's study, we had an awareness of this framework. And I asked about 1850 and the Sunday law. And Claudio mentioned the chart. The 1850 chart. Carry on. You gonna say more?
There is a Sabbath there, and there's more in the church went into the Laodicean condition at that moment.
So tell me a bit more about Sunday law and the chart.
That in the chart of 1843, there was no Sabbath. Everybody was a Sunday keeping.
So the 1850 chart mentions Sabbath. George, what does it not mention on the chart? Yeah. Just look around. What doesn't it mention? If you need help, I'll. It doesn't mention slavery. And that chart was created for a purpose. Jim, what was the chart created for? What's its purpose, its function? You're not sure? Just say not sure. That's fine. Kathy, what's the purpose of this chart? Go ahead.
To prepare people for the second coming of Jesus.
So Kathy says it's to prepare people for the second advent. Kathy, which people? So Kathy says the world. So this chart was created as an evangelistic tool. It's an aid or a helper to go to the world to tell them about the second advent. And in order to do that, what does the church, the movement, see fit to put on this chart? Kathy, what does it see fit to put on that chart? So it sees fit to put the Sabbath on the chart. And it misses what? It misses slavery. Okay. David, why? I'll give you two options. They make a mistake, an oversight. It's not on their radar. All that means they did something wrong. So is this a wrong chart? Or they did everything correct and it wasn't supposed to be on the chart? So the two options are dealing with the subject of slavery only. Why is it not on there? Mistake? Or it's not supposed to be on there. It's deliberate. And I'm not talking about the consciousness of the human. Unless we say it's a human mistake. Nathan.
The second option.
So David says, it's a good chart. and it wasn't supposed to be on there. Okay, so tell me what others of you think.
They were not supposed to be involved in politics, in the external events. They only were internally. God was leading them. They didn't want to be involved in the societal.
So Gloria says, maybe the reason it's not on there is because they were not meant to get involved in politics. In voting. They had a higher purpose. She didn't say that, but I kind of alluded to that. Did you want to say anything more? Okay, so they didn't want to get involved in the political mayhem of the day. They had a higher calling. Second Advent. And for them, the most important thing was to put the Sabbath in there. Okay, so does anybody else have any thoughts? Nobody has any thoughts? I saw you had. Susan, you don't have any thoughts? Just yes or no will do. Okay, do you have any? She said no, she doesn't have any questions. Susan, do you have any concerns? Yes or no? Okay, so she has some concerns, but she can't verbalize them. Okay, so Parminder, should Susan have some concerns? Yes, she should. So my question is, why should you have a concern? When we think about everything that we've discussed that's on the board and this person's question. Kathy, you don't have to answer that question, but you would make another point.
Well, maybe it does answer is they were supposed to be thinking politically. They should have been taking the whole picture in.
So Kathy says, perhaps they did something wrong and they should have been looking at the bigger picture, which means they should have been looking at the signs of the times, what was going on in the world. Is that fair representation?
The outside world, the outside of the church.
Sure. So
They needed to be taking in what was going on around them in the world. Yes.
and did you want to add anything? Because you said that before. No?
That's
Okay. So Kathy just summarized what she'd already said, so I won't repeat that. So my question is what? What's my question, Susan? Sorry? Why? Yeah, we should have a concern. Kathy. You could what? Okay, so Kathy says, if this is the message to the world and slavery is not on it, then when you go to the world and say, get your life in order, it doesn't include dealing with slavery. Is that kind of what you said? Okay. George, what are your thoughts? What are your concerns, if any?
1850 charts aligned with the Sunday law waymark.
So,
A testing message.
so Georgia says that the 1850 chart aligns with the Sunday law testing message.
The test was on slavery.
Sorry. Okay. Go ahead.
But the test was on slavery. But the message was about the new stuff added to the charts was the Sabbath and sanctuary. There's no warning about slavery.
So Georgia said, we have a model that says the test is slavery. 1850 slave law, the compromise, which ends up leading to the Civil War. And then the government has to deal with that issue between 63 and 65. That is the test that's facing, we'll say, the world or the United States. But the chart says only Sabbath. So we've got that far. And I think it's everything that we've said so far is factual. No opinions. So the opinion or the question now, the concern is that if you look at the evidence, 1888, we, God's church, says the test was Sunday sacredness or Sabbath keeping, depending on how you want to view it. It's the same issue. Two sides of the same coin. And if you go back and ask God's church, whether you want to call them the Millerites, Ellen White, or the Advent movement, what did they say is the test here? They're saying it's exactly the same thing. And now we have developed a model that says what? What does our model now say? Simply put. So our model says this history, it's all good and well, it's all fine. But when you come to this history, forget what the Millerites say. Forget what the Advent movement says. Forget what Ellen White says. Forget what the, if we can call it, I know it's not properly formed by then, but the General Conference is saying. Because they're all saying the same thing. What are they saying? George, what they're saying? They're saying Sabbath. And now we're saying, forget inspiration, everything that you thought you believed in, all the words that you've read, and we'll develop our own model. Thank you very much. And we'll make the test slavery. Human rights. And that's fundamentally different. Not just to a concept or a vacuum that didn't exist. It's not like that we've got some history that's blank and we've filled in the space that nobody worked out before. It's well documented, well laid out, properly thought through, with multiple references that all leads to a common place, which says that the test here is not slavery, but Sunday or Sabbath. And we've only scratched the surface. We haven't even gone into the inspired statements. We won't go into one now because we're vaguely familiar with them. But does anybody know, paraphrased, what does Ellen White say or think about this chart when he speaks about its creation? Because I asked a question earlier. Is there a mistake or a problem on this chart? David said no. In his estimation. And I'm asking the same question in Ellen White's estimation. And what does she say about this? Anyone on this side? Susan. Inspired by God. Gloria? Do you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, David?
This was taught way.
Oh, sorry. Susan said inspired by God. I don't know if I got that bit done. Okay.
In the movement.
David.
Yeah, this was taught way back in the movement. And
what David's about to say was taught way back in the movement.
we used to quote, I don't know if this is the exact words, but we would say that God was in the publishment.
So there's this is a paraphrase of an Ellen White statement, and I think it's accurate, that we used to say, quoting Ellen White, that God was involved in the publishing of this chart. Rightly or wrongly, we inferred that that meant there's no mistakes here. That this is a good chart. Kathy.
I was just gonna say, we said God's hand, she said God's hand was in the publish. I think that's the word, God's hand was in the publishment.
So Kathy has said basically the same thing. She added a couple of more words. So I don't know if anybody's good with their fingers, but maybe we'll be able to find that quote. Someone finds it, I'll put it down. So we have a model that says 50 and 88. It goes, we have a slavery model and a Sabbath model. And the one we're going to be picking up on is the 50. Test is slavery or equality or civil human rights. And it's not the Sabbath Sunday issue. So going back all the way to the beginning, I'm hoping that we can see that the person's question, I'm not saying people disagreed with this earlier, but it has some legitimacy to it. There is some theological, prophetic context or reason to ask. The question about how do we deal with Sabbath isn't just about this person wanting to do their own will, have an easy life. I don't know what the person was thinking, but what I wanted to show us is that there is a prophetic significance behind that question, built upon this 1850 model of human rights. That if this is the test, maybe we should view the Sabbath in a different light. Maybe like good advice. Maybe you think it doesn't have the relevancy that it used to have. Maybe it's not like the subject of wearing trousers or pants for women. Where's that taken from in the scriptures? Book first, Deuteronomy chapter. We're at Deuteronomy 22. And they beat me to it, verse 5. So when we approached that verse, what did we say? How does the movement relate to Deuteronomy 22, verse 5, Isabel? So I repeat the question. How does the movement relate or deal with Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 5, which is about, in modern language, women wearing pants or trousers? So we have, but we've got some Bible verse. What do we do with that Bible verse? If you're not sure, that's fine. So Isabel says it's an example. It's an example of what? Okay. Anyone else? So it's about gender roles. So my question is, what do we do with the verse now? Go for the best one. Oh, okay. Well, just do this one first then. If it is. Yes. So Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 says women can't wear trousers or pants. So what do we do with the verse?
Look at it. That's what it says. It says that the women are to go to war, because the verse talks about the clothing for men, warriors, that women at that point were not to wear the clothing of the warrior. That's my understanding of how we understand.
So Kathy's speaking now about the larger context. You have to go to the previous chapter, and then you see the context is about going to war and gender roles. But it still doesn't address my question. What do we do with the verse? How do we approach it? So I'll answer my own question. We go to that verse and we say it no longer applies to us. We'll just say it's an archaic statement. We'll just cross it out and we don't follow that anymore. It's not the only example, but it's an extreme example. Do we approach, or should we approach, the Sabbath in the same way? That's part of what's behind the person's original question. If we can go to Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 and basically raise it, how do we approach Exodus chapter 20, 8 to 11? In the same way? In a modified way? Or is it still a thus saith the Lord in all of its minutiae, in its intricacies? And I think it's based upon this issue here. That the movement no longer speaks about Sabbath being the test. It now speaks about equality being the test. And what do we do with the fourth commandment now? Is it in the same category as a dress code? Or do we just look at the principles of that commandment? Or do we break it line by line and still follow all of those rules? So before we do that, we have the reference for this.
13 MR.
Manuscript Releases, volume 13,
359.
page 359, paragraph 1. Is that right? Yep. Okay, so that's the reference. And someone here has read it, and I think it's accurate to what we said before. I'll paraphrase.
Yes, so the word hand is not there.
That's fine. Okay, so back to the point I was just raised a minute ago. Someone had their hand up.
It's still a moral obligation.
The student said the Sabbath is still a moral obligation, but it's not a test. So when you say it's not a test, is it a test to you? Or when you say a moral obligation, I'm not sure what you mean by that. So she says it's our moral duty to keep it. Susan, if you don't keep it, what will happen to you? A slap on the wrist or lake of fire? So Susan's not sure. She's not sure if keeping Sabbath is a life and death test any longer. Is that fair representation? She says, yes, it was an accurate representation of her thought, but there are consequences. But you're not sure if the consequences is life and death any longer. She nodded. But you used to believe it. Back in the day, you used to believe no Sabbath, death, eternal death. I presume. She said yes. So this is what's behind, I think, this person's question originally. And the more we dig down into this issue, it seems that if we're not a movement in crisis, we're a movement that's questioning something that we thought was really fundamental. So that's why I said we should be concerned about what we have put onto this board. Gloria.
Said that the Bible is examples, right? But how do you draw?
So Gloria said that
Yes, go ahead.
that I and Isabel, I don't know who came first, has said that the Bible is a book of examples, not principle.
So with the Sabbath.
Oh, carry on.
So with the Sabbath, do we draw out the principle of that to understand how to keep it, or no?
Okay, so Gloria said, does that mean that we're supposed to take the principle of the Sabbath as opposed to what, Gloria?
Example.
As opposed to the example. So what I thought that you were going to say, should we take the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? It comes up depending on if when you evangelize with people, that issue comes up often, or conservatives and liberals. The spirit or the letter. So I never thought there was a difference between them. But I guess some people think that there is. Claudia.
Know why I would be concerned? Because with what I know now, in the past, they shifted and they didn't study the prophetic message. So if they would find out that 1863 was in the 2520.
I'm going to have to stop you here. It's too much and I need to have it contained so I can understand, so they can say what point you're making. So, Claudio, are you suggesting that that God's church in the past made some kind of mistake? Is that what you're suggesting? Claudio said yes, he thinks there were some mistakes made. If they had studied and researched things properly, Claudio, what would have happened if they had done things properly? What would they have found?
And also studying that more.
So you're speaking about the 2520, I understand that. How does it relate to our study? Go ahead.
Because if they would understand that, we do the same thing you did in 2012 and understand that 2014 was the Sunday law, but not the Sunday law, Sunday Sabbath. You know, the principle behind all the Sunday laws is oppression, church and state, the mark of the beast.
Okay, so what Claudio has said is that the whole approach to this is one about human oppression. And if you put that framework on top of this, it explains all of these problems. So I don't know if people see it that way or they agree. Georgia, do you have your hand up? Okay. Someone else? Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? Gloria.
So to answer to the person that asked that question, how would you answer it?
So if you're asking about so the question, Gloria said, how would I answer this person's question? I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to answer that question. And the reason is because in some people's mind, my answers carry more weight than other people's answers. And that's okay in some contexts. I understand that. But the reason that I don't want to answer it in this particular case is because I wanted us to see this point. And I wanted us to go beyond, and I hope you understand what I'm about to say, to go beyond the carnal nature of the question. That even though it may have just been a practical thing that they were looking an answer for, I want us to know why they're asking that question. And I think in the consciousness of members in this movement, there has been a radical shift in our thinking. And so Gloria's question to me wasn't just about a member attending the class on Sabbath. It's whether or not this radical shift in change, this radical change in thinking, as we view the Sabbath, if I think that's a good idea or a bad idea. And I don't think it would be safe for me to answer that without giving all of you an opportunity to think about the issues at stake. In whatever shape or form, to whatever degree, the fact that we're discussing this, the fact that we're looking at the chart, we see the tension between Sabbath and slavery. We look at all of Ellen White's writings and question them. The fact that we're doing that, as a minimum, I think it should concern and worry us. So that when we come to whatever conclusion we come to, that we're happy about that. Because 4 years ago, 3 to 4 years ago, depending on how you do your calculation, we threw away a fundamental Bible verse. We took Ellen White quotes and just erased them. And we said, we're good to go. We are not only correct to do that, we have to do that. And no one objected. Talking about wearing pants or trousers. And I don't know if men and women in this movement have realized what we've done. Because when we start doing or looking at Exodus chapter 20, we get confronted with exactly the same issues. Do we view Sabbath differently? The test. Is it a moral obligation or is it a test? If we're not persuaded that it's a life and death issue, are we comfortable with our thought processes? Susan, the subject of equality. So if a man or a woman is either the patriarch or the matriarch of their sphere of influence, is that a life and death issue? So Susan said yes. So you're burning the lake of fire for patriarchy. Yeah, she said yes. But she's not sure if you're burning the lake of fire for breaking the Sabbath. I'm not picking on her. But if she's thinking that, if her thinking has changed that much on something that identifies who we are, we're Seventh-day Adventists, I'm sure she's not the only one. And how we view the Sabbath is not just a moral issue. It's also a prophetic one. And if we start changing our relationship morally with something, we begin changing our relationship with that issue prophetically as well. We must change it prophetically. If you're not sure about that, just work through the pants or the trouser issue in your mind. Work through the steps and the logic, and you'll see that point. If you change your morality, you change your prophecy. And vice versa. If you change your prophecy, it affects your morality.
Sabbath issue, would you say morally conservative but socially liberal?
So Gloria said, with respect to the Sabbath, is it morally conservative and socially liberal? I'm going to show my ignorance now. I'm not sure what that means.
Like, so, just the way that you can,
Okay.
so you keep the Sabbath the way that you consciously think that is right, but let others do whatever they need to do, because you don't know their situation, their circumstances.
So Gloria said, hello? Gloria said, morally conservative, socially liberal means you are strict about the issue yourself and you don't judge other people. So if that were the case, then Sabbath would no longer be a test for the world. It only becomes a test for Adventists, which would then mean if someone wanted to become an Adventist or join the movement, are we able to test them on their Sabbath keeping or not? You're not sure, Samuel? We can't test them. I think it's just the logic of that. Forget the morality. The logic would tell you if we say you're free to do what you want and we won't monitor it or check it or judge it, then it no longer becomes a test for them. And if you get to that stage, it's a skip and a step to say it's not even a test for you. Because what you'll now have begun to do is have a two-tier system. One rule for them, one rule for me. And that becomes really problematic, I think. Any other thoughts? Okay, so I wasn't expecting us to come to a conclusion in these studies. But I wanted to highlight several points. So I wanted to highlight several points that I think members in the movement have not considered. Or thought about and got to a place where they see what the conclusion is. So this is not a judgment on any individual person. But if this group that we have here in person was a representation of our movement, we're not sure if it's okay if a school forces you to attend a class on Sabbath, whether it's okay to say yes or no. We're not sure about that. We're questioning whether or not Sabbath is even a life and death issue, which I would then argue means that it's not a test to join this movement. And if it's not a test for them to join the movement, it can't be a test for us to remain in the movement. And once you get to that stage, the fourth commandment would go to the same place as Deuteronomy 22 verse 5. Because do women in our movement have to wear, I keep saying trousers, but pants if you forget. Do women have to wear trousers all the time? No, they can wear what they want now. So women have understood what those verses say and have come to a place where they have freedom to do what they want. Which means trouser wearing or pant wearing is no longer a test. It was never a test even in 19. It served as a symbol of something more profound, more deeper. So back in Germany, it was framed as a test. And I still think that was appropriate. So the question is, do we approach Sabbath keeping in the same way? We have a Nethinim join us. We explain all of our philosophies and our ideas, our theological position. Do we say to them, let's check what you're wearing? Would we do that? Some people are adamant, like, no, we don't. And some people are looking, I'm not sure, maybe we do. We don't check, are you wearing trousers or skirts? We don't do that, do we? So it's not a test. But we would explain the concept of gendered clothing and the world in which we live. So if we're okay, we're together on that point. How do we approach the fifth commandment? Do we say, What is the fifth commandment? Honor your parents. So we might have a discussion of what that means, but do we say that's still in force? For sure we would. Because we could easily tuck it into the concept of civil rights. And if this Nethinim says, well, I abused my parents, can I join you? We'd say, no, it's a test of fellowship. And someone said earlier, if you're abusive, you can't go to heaven and you'll go into the lake of fire. So the question is, let's go to the fourth commandment. Is that a test of fellowship or not? When we talk about morally conservative, socially liberal, because when we start viewing the Sabbath that way, we get to the place where we don't have the Sabbath. We acknowledge it as a historical fact, as a past moral imperative, but we get to the place where we say it's no longer applicable. And the questioner asked, the movement. And if you're the movement, or at least part of it, you and I need to come to a place that we understand our relationship to the Sabbath. And how it fits into the prophetic model that we have. When we talk about the restoration in this Eden to Eden model. We've spoken about civil rights being restored. Ellen White calls it what? What institution is that? In her words. No, an institution, she says, as it was then, so it's going to be now. So there's some restoration that needs to happen. We have slavery and civil rights, but she uses a word, a relationship. Marriage. So yeah, so what I was talking about was marriage. So, which is a social construction. So she says marriage to marriage. And then in our group, they said it's actually two things. And Davey said the second one was the Sabbath. So I'll write seventh as the seventh day. And as you know, this model here that predated the Eden to Eden model is exactly the same model. So the Eden to Eden model was not something new. It was in the consciousness of this movement a long time ago. It was just framed differently and less well refined. In the same way, we knew about 50. Its connection to the chart which was an evangelistic tool to go to the world and warn them about the second advent, which is the context of the Sunday law, which is why it's there. And if you go to 1848, Ellen White's going to begin to prepare the church for 50. Because there's trouble in the world, political agitation, and Adventists are saying, what are they saying if we know the history? This is the end. This is the Sunday law. She says, not, it's not that. She says, this is the prelude to what's about to happen. We've known all of this a long time ago. There's more continuity between the messages of Elder Jeff and Elder Tess than some people appreciate. So when we come back to this modeling, many of us, prior to what I've just drawn there, would say it's only this relationships based upon this modeling here of the 1850. And we'd say, well, Ellen White talks about twin institutions, but we'll do away with that. But we constructed a chiastic structure based upon that Ellen White quote. Before the Eden to Eden model was ever developed. It's crude, it's basic, but it follows the same principle. And if it's a methodological issue here, it's not so easy to throw it away. So we're going to close now. We have a study tomorrow, and we'll recap and see if we can discuss this a little bit more or move on to a new subject. I'm not quite sure yet. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we know and we believe that you are in control. We know that you are leading us along the narrow path. The midnight cry behind us and Jesus in front of us. Help us to have the confidence to believe that we are still being led by our past experience and what the future is before us. May we not be a movement in crisis, but may we continue to be led and directed by your will, wherever it may lead us. As we wrestle with our relationship to you, to your laws and your commandments, your counsel and your advice, I ask that we would hear your voice as it permeates through our movement, and that we would come to a proper and right conclusion. Not just on the Sabbath, but on all the issues that confront us. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everybody. I'll hand you over to the host now.